here to make sure, as we're thinking here at this Education Summit, that you don't forget our youngest learners, and making sure that we think about how racial disparities get in the way of their future success. So I'm Myra Jones-Taylor, the Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3, where our sole mission is to make sure that all babies have a strong start in life. And Dr. Marla Dean is going to introduce herself in a moment. There are 4 million babies. 4 million babies will be born in this country this year. 51% of those babies are children of color. And the 0 to 3's recent State of Babies yearbook makes it very clear that we are not doing well by our babies, all of our babies. But those 51% of children who are of color who will be born this year, we are really setting up to fail them if we don't address structural inequality and racism in this country. And so as you think about your days and your daily work, I want to make sure that you consider those 4 million babies who will end up in your schools shortly, and making sure that we're setting them up for success.
Good morning, I'm Marla Dean, and I'm the Executive Director of Bright Beginnings. I'm located here in Washington, D.C. We operate early childhood and adult learning centers for children and families experiencing homelessness. So we work with the most marginalized population in the city, and in 2016, there were approximately 2,700 children under the age of 5 who were experiencing homelessness in D.C.
And we know in our country there are a few ways that our youngest learners, have access to high-quality learning experiences. They get it through early Head Start, through a child care subsidy, which can go to programs, home-based programs, center-based programs, paired up with early Head Start, and then, of course, preschool for the older youngest learners. But we know that we are failing to reach children in all of those categories. So for early Head Start, only 7% of children who are eligible for early Head Start actually have access to it. Similarly, with our child care subsidy, only 7 to 8% of children have access to that. And then, of course, with our pre-K, it really depends on the school system at the local level, the state level, and then, of course, there are some federal funding streams to help make that happen. Interestingly, though, there are some disparities when it comes to our racial access to people of color, children of color. Interestingly, Black children have higher access rates than all other groups of children when it comes to the child care subsidy. But don't get too excited. There are only 15% of Black children in this country have access to child care subsidy. So still, we are woefully underserving. But if you look at disparities among Asian American children, for example, only 3% of Asian American children in this country have access to the child care subsidy. So this is a huge gap. So that's one thing in terms of access. Once children get into programs, let's talk about preschool. We know that there are huge disparities when it comes to children actually being able to stay in those classrooms. So believe it or not, preschoolers are more likely to be expelled than any other age group, any other school grade in this country. Preschoolers are 3 times, I know, I'm seeing all your faces, this is shocking, 3 times more likely to be expelled than any other age group in this country. 3 times more likely. And there are huge racial disparities. 18% of our preschoolers in this country are Black children. However, they make up 48% of expulsions in preschool, 48%. My dear colleague and friend Walter Gilliam is fond of saying, who spearheaded all this research, that there are 3 risk factors when it comes to being expelled in this country. They're all tied to racism. Black, and they're the 3 Bs. Big Black boy. If you are any of those, or all 3 of those, you are far more likely to be expelled. We are failing our children, and if you get back to that point that 51% of our children are children of color, they're going to be taking care of us. We have to get this right if we want to have a strong future in this country.
So we don't expel anyone at Bright Beginnings, so I want to start there. That's not something we do. But I've been in education for 30 years, and actually I was a K-12 educator long before I went into the early childhood and early Head Start space. And I've worked in some of the most tough schools. And so this issue around disparity around suspension, exclusion, push out is a serious issue. At Bright Beginnings, one of the ways that we try and address it is because first, we start with our children at birth. Some of our mothers are actually still prenatal. We have a home visiting program where we have mothers, our staff go to where they are. It sounds interesting to use the word home visiting when you're talking about families experiencing homelessness, but wherever they may be, we go, we check. And we have 3 goals: make sure that there's a safe, nurturing environment, school readiness, and then helping parents support them as they move from crisis to self-sufficiency. So we have a complete wraparound services, therapeutic, health and wellness, workforce development, adult education, so that we can support that. But one of the things we've been really concentrating on at Bright Beginnings is this concept of what we call, people talk about social capital. We're talking about something a little different. It's called developmental capital. And that's where you work with parents to really understand the K-12 system, how it organizes itself, and how it can marginalize your child. And so because our parents are already marginalized, this is something we spend a lot of time with because we recognize that many of our children will become those statistics. We're fortunate here in DC that they've passed laws where you really can't suspend, but there's something called push out, and people find ways to get around things, and so we know that. And so we want our parents to be prepared when they see signs of that, when they see signs of over-identification, when they see that when a child does have needs, they're not being met, that they can advocate successfully with their children as they leave us and continue in their K-12 education. That's something we have to be very explicit about because we recognize those types of disparities, and we know that homeless children, if you want to talk about another factor, will even put them at a higher risk.
So one thing that I want you all to think about is the future of advocacy and what you all can do to change these outcomes and make sure that the children that we care about are really set up for success. And so in terms of access to early learning experiences, high quality early learning experiences, there's a lot that we're doing at 0 to 3 and many of our colleagues are doing on the advocacy front to make sure, or education front to make sure that children have access. So the things that you can track are access to CCDBG, the Child Care Development Block Grant. This is important for you, even if you're in the K-12 system, to make sure that children have access to these high-quality programs. We are very fortunate. We had a historic increase last year of $5.8 billion, but we still know that the lion's share of children are not being served. We're trying to get that number increased again. Also, Early Head Start is about to celebrate its 25th anniversary. But again, with only 7 to 8% of our children who are eligible being served, my goodness, we need to be doing better. So we are pushing for that on that front. And the other thing I just want to say about this push out is that this takes all kinds of forms. There are people who will say that there's not the right fit. It just didn't work out, and I was one of those kids. We went to my mother was fortunate enough to get me a scholarship to go to a private, very fancy program when I was a child. But we were poor folks who my mother had to put us on a bus, 3 buses, to get me to this high-quality preschool program. Then she had to take 2 buses to get to work. But in the evenings, it was hard. She couldn't make that happen all the time, so we had a whole network of friends who she trusted to pick me up in the evening. She was not letting any old person pick me up. But the preschool program, thought that our values didn't match the values of that program. And so at the age of 4, I was expelled from preschool because we had too many people picking me up from school. Wow. So expulsion happens in all kinds of ways. It's not because a child's acting out. It could just be that there are folks who don't recognize what poor folks do on a daily basis to get their children to school and don't have Dr. Dean making sure that there are equitable outcomes and equitable places that honor all kinds of families.
Wow.
I just thought I'd throw that in there.
At Bright Beginnings, we actually have a logistical nightmare because there's so many people on the list that can pick up children. As long as you have your ID and you're on the list, you can pick up a child because we do understand that. And then our staff is more than willing to stay late if a parent is behind because, yes, they are traveling from many places across the city. We provide transportation support. I mean, we really try and think about every potential barrier and make sure that we're not participating in those type of activities to push children out. Mm-hmm. I think when I think about one of the other things that's really important is we have a program where we're closing the vocabulary gap. Mm-hmm. And this is really important because we know that more affluent children are exposed to more words, and not just exposed to more words, but this conversational turn. And we know this is a critical time, birth to 5, where the brain is actually developing, wiring itself. And so if you're having conversation, we see this when you get to grade 3, when children go from reading to learning to read to reading to learn, that if they have not been exposed to that type of language readiness, we see that gap begin to develop and then persist. So we have something called LENA, where we're actually tracking how many words our children are exposed to. It goes home with them. It's with our teachers. We upload that data. We're having these conversations with our home visitors, our family advocates, our teachers, and our parents about how you can change a declarative kind of question to one that's more open-ended, that stimulates and develops language. And so those types of things, because we really understand that there are many ways. And I'm a former turnaround principal. I've seen push out in a major way. I see push out even at the early childhood level, where some centers won't accept children who have subsidies. Mm-hmm. I mean, that way, that's kind of a push out in some way. So this is a persistent problem, and we have to figure out a way that all children, as some of the high schoolers said from New York, I was so impressed with them, that all children have equal access to opportunity, because lack of opportunity results in an achievement gap.
So parting thoughts for those of you who are in the K-12 system: make sure that you connect with the early childhood folks, whether or not they're down the hall, they're in another community, because we need to make sure that those 4 million babies that will be born this year and that will eventually show up in your classes have all that they need to succeed and thrive in your classes and in the future.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, this is you get to close it out.
The women, and they're largely women who work in this field. At our center, they're highly qualified, they have bachelors, they have masters, and they are underpaid. And there's something we have to do about mostly Black and brown women who are in this field doing this work, and the rate of pay that they receive and how they persist. They get their bachelors and their masters, and yet they will never be rewarded for it in terms of their salary. So that's something we have to work on as a country.
Amen to that. Thank you all.